Creek, the name for Bull Creek, the Indian name is Boy Killed by Buffalo Bull Creek. So the last part is always used as Bull Creek. And we would sit on our porch and you hear that, the walk Teepee Teepee, which is a dance hall. It was it had 4 square sides and had 1 or 2 windows. And that's where that was their dance hall. Teepee Teepee was the dance teepee. The big wooden building, and at night you could hear those soft drums. And incidentally, when they sit around a drum, there'd be 5 or 6 men sitting around the drum, and they got almost perfect harmony on that drum beat. They're able to coordinate that so that it gets that thump, 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 thump. And of course, just as the white man has different songs, why the Indian has different interpretations of what they were talking about, the old days and their history and their I want to say is the story of their life. We went several times in the evening to the dance, and they had the gas lights, and they did something different than they do now. You go to the celebration now, Indian celebration, and the squaws and all of them get when they dance, then they participate. But in those days, the squaws formed a big ring around the outside of the hall, and then as the Indian men danced in the middle, they would do one quick step counterclockwise and rotated around. That's the way they did. And it, I suppose that as the Indian woman become emancipated, that was done away with. And I hadn't seen that, but I remember it as a kid. In the early days, well, after the early 1905, 1906, why it was sometimes the Indian police would send the white people home because the Indians would get pretty worked up and no one tell what was going to happen. The big thing about is the Indian history of this area was that this was there was 3 migration routes. The buffalo came up from the Kansas, Republican River, and down in there where they wintered down there, and then they migrated north. The simple reason that the buffalo migrated north was as they ate the grass off in the spring, and then as the spring went north, moved north, and the grass became green and green, so they would migrate as far as Saskatchewan before they would turn around and then follow the grass back down to their winter quarters again. The 3 big migration routes were Wyoming, and the one was across the Badlands, and the other was right through this area, where they crossed between the Beagle and the Little Beagle Hills. So this area where we are now is one of the major migration routes, and they came here by the south. And incidentally, as they left here, we had prairie dogs in the area too, and the prairie dogs, what happened was that the prairie dog population was regulated by the buffalo, and they turned the prairie dog population also regulated the buffalo, so that this is the way it happened. As the buffalo the mounds of dirt that the prairie dog would leave. Then that would the bulls would paw that, and that was what caused the buffalo wall. And eventually it sunk away, and over eons of time, why these walls became deeper and deeper, the ground became. Well, when I said the buffalo also and the prairie dogs, the rotation was controlled, is the only thing that really had any effect on the buffalo. They didn't have very, they had a few buffalo wolves, and the Indian people, which were in those days before they acquired the horse, well, they weren't very effective in eliminating very many buffalo. But as the buffalo had one other thing, it had a disease, which is we call anthrax, it's called the blood disease, in which the buffalo hunters that hunted for buffalo for profit would sometimes get it. The Indians seem to have uncanny sense and know when not to touch. But this was anthrax, and an old Indian told my father that they died by the thousands in these fields here. And what happened was that in the drought, or this was short grass country. The eastern river was called long grass country. This had mostly buffalo grass, and as the droughts came along, then where the prairie dogs operated, well, then the grass became extremely short. And the anthrax germ lives right at close to the top, partly just at the ground level, so that when they crop close, well, then they would pick up the anthrax germ. And when the buffalo would be decimated, well, then the grass grew up, and that controlled the prairie dogs, because the natural enemies could get at them. And this hard crossing, was a hard crossing between the little Beagle and the big Beagle hills. And it must have taken eons before they found their crossing, and these buffalo would fan out into eastern South Dakota, and then when winter came back down, or they would cross back. Sometimes they would try to cross on the ice, but if you ever had a little bunch of cows and ever driven them any distance down the road, maybe 2 or 3 times in succession, and the old cow will cut across someplace, and it only takes, no matter how many times you drive them down that road, they come to that same place, they'll cut across at the same place. So that's the way the buffalo inherited, knew where this crossing was. Of course, with this crossing, then with the numerous buffalo, then you have Indian people that had descended on the buffalo, which served as their, they ate everything and used everything but the bell. You run out of tape.
I got plenty yet.
And the thing about this area here, the buffalo Indians probably came across from the Sur, and this is where the two tribes, the Lower Brule and the Brule and the Ogallala. And the question, and we know they came out of northern Minnesota, and then there was a trader at Le Sueur, and then they stayed around their coast and traded for quite a few years. And at that time, the Ogallala and the Brule And incidentally, they said the bull has a different name, has a little more vulgar name. It means burnt thigh, but it also has another little different meaning in that. But they were both in this area of Le Sueur. So the thing about it, when they came to the Perry, it was a hostile Perry because they were on foot, they had dogs, it was the only method of transportation in the Troy. And they had, so that they didn't come out onto the Perry very easily because there was fires and buffalo stampedes and no protection actually. But they sent parties out, individuals out, and they came out and lived in Ricca for a while. Ricca, which was north of Medicine Butte, near the edge of the Bad River, in those villages, and they observed how the Ricca operated. And then when they came back, brought their people with them out of Omaha, had lived in eastern South Dakota, western Minnesota, and Iowa, and Omaha came out to the river, and then Omaha were forced south. Incidentally, we had a man that was called Kills Omaha, so that somewhere in the background was whether his father, his grandfather had killed in Omaha. And as the Omaha was forced south, then the Brule and the Ogallala migrated across the plains, and they only made about 5 miles a day. And everybody, even 8-year-olds, carried everything had to be transported on back or by dogs. And incidentally, in the dogs, when they were in permanent quarters, they would take the pups and specially feed them for about 4 or 5 weeks, and that served as a staple food for them. And it took them quite a while, and what happened was they started cutting their Ricca off from their hunting and also their fields, so that the Ricca was forced north. It came probably about in 1740, something like that. It was not definite. And they came across north of the White River and south of the Bad River, where they came across. And they were Ricca were being forced north. Ricca had horses, but the Sioux didn't have horses, and that's one of the things you quite understand, because the first horses were introduced by the Spanish into Texas in the 1500s. The Indians tell me the first horse that they ever saw was in the vicinity of what would be now Oklahoma. They also said they had a horse, a small horse, but everybody said, "Oh, that was the original horse was back here in the days of the centuries ago." But now they believe that the horse, Indians had the horse, or the horse was in the area, but they didn't have any idea what about riding the horse or anything like that, and they used them mainly as a food source, and they eliminated the horse completely. But I don't know how true this is, but that's some of the things to think about. Now we're going to talk about these were Laura Brule here, Indians in our area, and they established a day school in 1898 on the north, it was east of Rattlesnake Butte, so it's on the north side on the south side of the Little Beagle Hills. The day school operated, I suppose, probably 10 or 12 years. They had about 40 families there, and it had a spring. It was operated by the Episcopalians, and what determined what had a lot to do with the so-called attempt to Christianize the Indians was that the Indian, the welfare of the Indian was turned over to the president, and the president turned it over to Pabia's favorite church. So the Presbyterian and Episcopalians were mostly, we didn't have any Catholic presidents, so that was why they held the inside part. The Medicine Butte has a special significance because it meant Holy Butte, and part of that after they crossed the river was. And the Lower Brule, which in our area, came out of Lower Brule. Well, they were moved out of this area several times by the Army to Fort Yates, and weren't told they couldn't settle here. And the old several of the bucks would sneak out of Fort Yates and come back down here. So the government finally gave up and let them came down. And the reason they were called Lower Brule was they did some farming. And the Brule and the Ogallala had contempt for anybody that did any farming. There was no way that they were strictly hunting people and fighting people. The Sioux, the name means snake, was called snakes because their primary, they didn't have anything to do with the white man. That's probably why it was so long before they adopted the horse, because they stayed away from the white man as much as they possibly could. Now to go back into local history, and where the farm where I live is part of the Butte, which has the Buffalo Cave on. And this goes back in history, and part of my land to the east of me has been a big encampment. One time there was a lot of stone hammers and arrow and skin scrapers, so that this has been a big encampment at one time. And one of the places, like on the Buhawk land, it probably had Indians that was here long before white man. They evidently came up onto the flats, and this area was full of lakes, and they had lots of ducks, and they came up here and probably, I think, realized that this was before the teepee. They probably lived in brush huts, and there were a lot of willows in here. And one thing about the buffalo, there were no trees in here. And the reason there was no trees on the plains because the old buffalo, he ate everything and pushed everything down. And so that the only thing that really survived was up in the bluffs and the hills was the plum and the chokecherry, which were extremely hard to destroy. So that in this particular Buffalo Cave was evidently a big landslide, and it probably happened about 1811, because in that particular time this area, the whole Mississippi River system was subject to a severe earthquake, and in fact the Mississippi ran backwards for several days, which the whole land was settled, and the effect on the hill to the west of us was very severe, because it's one of the most severe landslides that I've ever seen. And the rock fell out, and as it fell out, it left a big hole in the bottom. And if you go back into Indian history, and you'll find that this is the way that Indian was supposed to begin. Is this Indian maiden, the white buffalo maiden, opened the, the cave, and as she came into the cave, while everything was immobile. What I'm saying is that everything was just like it was a statue frozen there. And she waved her hand, and the buffalo became alive and came out of the cave, and followed by the Indian people and all the other animals. They believed they thought this is what's called grandfather land. It came out of the grandfather land. And one of the significant things about the eagle that they had was that the eagle could soar out of sight. And why they had great wonderment about the eagle, because he could soar out of sight. In other words, he would carry the message back to grandfather land. The grandfather land, they didn't believe, was not a, well, it was just land below the land. It was not at the center of the earth or anything like that. That was, they had no idea about being the earth ground or anything like that. And they had their time where they had 13 months, and the first year came about April, and it was called the year of the calves, the month of the calves. In other words, this was all moon time. In other words, this when the calves were born, well, that was called the month of the calves. And that was when the month began, on the year began. On the West Butte and the East Hills could also call Nogi or Negi, which means spirit hills. On the West Butte, in the 30s, we found a great, after the dirt and the grass was exposed, well, there was great, like big rooms of rock laid out on a geometric program of some kind, and it must have been a way the local Indians don't know anything, have just never heard anything about that, they don't know anything about it, so it was probably laid out by previous people in the area with the idea of keeping some sort of sun time. And this cave was, as the legend about the medicine man set down probably about 3 miles, 2.5, 3 miles south of this hill is known as Tatankapaha, which means Buffalo Butte. And the warriors were all lined up on the West Butte and behind a high ridge, and he proceeded to make his medicine. And the white buffalo, which is the sacred buffalo, was supposed to came out and started down towards the Bull Creek. And as one warrior got a little anticipation and couldn't stand it any longer, so he poked his head up over the hill. And the white buffalo returned and fled back to the cave, and all that was any sign was left was just a big cloud of dust in the cave. Some people think that the cave ran all the way over to the Missouri River. I think that's more fictionalized than anything else.